Hello, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Toward a Decolonial Psychology, Three Scholars in North American Settings. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few webinar logistics. This webinar will run for 1 hour. All attendees on the webinar are muted except for the webinar facilitator and our presenters. If at any point during the webinar you have a question, please type it into the question box on the dashboard on your screen. Please keep your questions short and ideally to no more than 20 to 25 words. These questions will be answered to the extent that time permits during our Q&A portion of the webinar. After the webinar, I will follow up with all webinar attendees to share today's slides and the link to SPSSI's YouTube channel, where a recording of today's webinar will be posted. I'm Cindy Lucas, Communications Director at the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, or SPSSI, and I will now turn the webinar over to Dr. Glenn Adams, who will be the moderator of today's panel. Thank you for joining.
Hello, and thank you for joining. We're going to move right into the presentations without any hesitation. Our first presenter is Professor Sunil Bhatia from Connecticut College in the United States.
All right, thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Professor Glenn Adams, for inviting me to participate in this conference in Cape Town in South Africa. I'm very honored to be here. Good afternoon to all the attendees and to the audience members. I can't see you, but I can feel you. I want to begin my talk by revisiting the moment when Martin Luther King Jr. took the podium in 1967 and challenged the members of American Psychological Association in Washington, D.C. by giving a very powerful speech. King made a call to reduce the inequality gaps between the conditions of the Negro and white America. And he reminded everyone about the need to end segregation. He said, if the Negro needs social sciences for direction and for self-understanding, the white society is even more urgent need. White America needs to understand that it's poisoned to its soul by racism, and the understanding needs to be carefully documented and consequently more difficult to reject. The present crisis arises because although it's historically imperative that our society take the next step to equality, we find ourselves psychologically and socially imprisoned. In that speech, he further spoke about how urban riots, the nonviolent protests, the Vietnam War, civil disobedience, and the role of psychologists in bringing about social change. Then he did something very dramatic, and he ended his speech by arguing that our world desperately needs an organization, and he called the organization the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. He bemoaned that our psychology has become too easily adjusted to conditions of great inequality and racism. He reminded the psychologists in the audience that the field of psychology has given this great word called maladjustment, which implies an adjustment to destructive or negative behavior. At APA, that our society should always remain maladjusted to some grim realities. And this is what he said. There are some things concerning which we must always be maladjusted if we are to be people of goodwill. We must never adjust ourselves to racial discrimination and racial segregation. We must never adjust ourselves to bigotry. We must never adjust ourselves to the economic conditions that take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few. We must never adjust ourselves to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of violence. To me, Martin Luther King's speech was about decolonizing psychology, or if you want to call it, decolonial psychology. A psychology that is politicized, that remains maladjusted to the underlying structures of oppression, racism, subjugation, and injustice. My recent book, Decolonizing Psychology, Globalization, Social Justice, and Indian Youth Identities, is inspired by Martin Luther King Jr.'s call and is an attempt to keeping psychology in my more modest way, creatively and politically maladjusted. So the book is kind of anchored in larger questions. I would put three questions out there. The first one is, how has Euro-American psychology as a dominant mode of knowledge production supported racism, colonization, Orientalism, and neoliberalism. The second question is, what kind of stories do contemporary youth, Indian youth from elite, middle class, and working class tell about themselves and others in the context of neoliberalization? And then the last one is, how can we co-create, share, imagine, and dream of an alternative psychology that speaks to the contemporary psychological and material conditions of marginalized lives in the global South? One of the most tragic erasures while I was writing this book was to learn and read that there are about over 360 million Indian youth whose stories are absolutely, completely missing from the canon of psychology. There are probably about 6 to 7 studies which, if at all, talk about their experiences of being in the global South, either mischaracterizes or caricatures that, or there is complete overlooking of their life or their narratives and their stories. So the questions about colonization and decolonization in psychology have preoccupied me well for over 2 decades and have been the animating impetus for much of my scholarship. So in thinking about the decolonial turn for this particular conference, I was really moved by a piece that Jesica wrote, where she spoke about why we need a decolonizing psychology that provides possibilities for social change and a psychology that creates a qualitative shift in how we forge links between knowledge and practice. So I want to make some points about that as to what does decolonial praxis mean, especially based on the ethnographic work that I've done in India for the last 10 years. So there are a few questions that I keep coming back to, which I want to share with you. One is, why decolonize? What is the purpose of decolonization? Whose stories get told? What knowledge is considered legitimate? Whose lives are considered central to the future of psychology? What does decolonization desire? What does it really want? And how does my story or scholarship become a threat to the imperialism of psychology? So here are 3 very brief points, given that our time is very short, to make in regards to some of these questions that have been preoccupied for, I would say, very, very long time. So I think first I would like to say that we need to locate decolonization through our positionality, through our social location, basically through where we stand. We need to tell our individual story of how we came to decolonization. Milner argues that dangers seen, unseen, and unforeseen can emerge for researchers when they do not pay careful attention to their own and others' racialized and cultural systems of coming to know, knowing, and experiencing the world. So these 3 elements to me are really critical in understanding decolonizing or decolonization process. That is, how do we come to know, what is knowing, and how we experience the world. So to me, decolonization is not an abstract system of words, it is deeply personal. I wrote Decolonizing Psychology to unsettle, interrupt, and break free from the sedimented and colonial structure of Euro-American psychological science. I first encountered this version of colonial psychology in my undergraduate, in my university days, where Britain's imperial rule of India was racist and ruthless as it oppressed, imprisoned, and tortured Indians over 200 years. Its policies created famines that killed over 35 million Indians. Another million people died. More than 13 million people became displaced during the violent and tragic partition of India. And the British used psychological and social science knowledge to justify descriptions of my ancestors as primitive, as rude, backward, lazy, ignorant, and Churchill called them a beastly people. Yet I was taught in my 7 years of psychology that British and European culture and its people were more correct, legitimate, and superior to the Indian culture. And then once again, when I came to the United States to study, I encountered this somewhat racist and benevolent form of psychology, which was much more centered on whiteness and American identity as a norm. But to me, in this process of decolonization, these were my first and deep lessons in what I would call internalized racism that I accepted as normal, but which I want to argue today, it's not individualistic, but it's rather structural. So the post-colonial condition, the reason why we need to talk about internalized colonialism is because in the previously colonized countries of the global South, we have experienced what's called as second colonization. This kind of colonialism and coloniality, Ashish Nandi says, colonizes the mind as well as the body. So now the West is everywhere, from a geographical and temporal entity to a psychological category. It's in the structures and in minds. And this is what Fanon calls new humanity, a kind of coming to terms with your internalized colonialism is coming to terms with your new humanity. The second part of decolonial modernity turn is to identify and map what Tuai Smith calls a psychological imperialism underlying the knowledge production of Euro-American psychological science. She speaks about the specific epistemic violence that's been done by psychology in the way it's dehumanized, erased, and silenced, and exploited, marginalized others. Let me just take one example from my book, where I speak about models of human development and identity development created by Erik Erikson. Now, here's a passage from his book where he speaks about the loss of identity in Black children. Oops, sorry. He says, Negro babies often receive sensual satisfaction, which provides them with enough oral and sensory surplus for a lifetime, as clearly betrayed in the way they move, laugh, talk, sing. Their forced symbiosis with the feudal South capitalized on this oral sensory treasure and helped to build the slave's identity, mild, submissive, dependent, somewhat querulous, but always ready to serve with occasional empathy and childlike wisdom. So this is the kind of hidden narrative of the term identity crisis. And Erikson primarily claims that this Black children's physicality or this sensuality makes them malleable to acquiring a slave identity. This he wrote in the 1960s. And so what I'm saying today in my talk is that this imperialism, this racist depictions of marginalized population is also in somewhat present today in the current kind of neoliberal context. Today, the imperialism of cross-cultural American psychology also takes many similar forms. One of the forms it takes is clearly visible in the direct circulation of Euro-American psychological knowledge and products that contribute to the ideology of a neoliberal self. I have shown in my ethnographic work how urban Indian call center youth and management workers are expected to largely follow the ideology of Western corporate culture through individual transformation, embracing a self-orientalizing framework, acquiring new behaviors of emotional intelligence, assertiveness, flexibility, productivity, and self-regulation. So over a period of 5 years, I followed the ways in which current psychological instruments are being used in China, parts of Africa, parts of India as a way to regulate employees. So soft skills psychological workshops are conducted to create assertive, confident, happy, and self-reliant workers. So my point is that when corporate cross-cultural psychology, psychological science merges with the neoliberal language of enterprise, structural inequality, cross-cultural racism, mental health issues, and ethnocentrism becomes camouflaged as simple problems of cross-cultural difference and cultural misunderstandings that can be solved through individual effort, self-help therapy, and importation of Western mental health taxonomies and diversity training. So my final and third point has to do with the imperative for decolonial scholars in the academy to work with people on the ground and activists who are engaged in social justice struggles. Canadian activist Syed Hassan writes that decolonization is a dramatic reimagining of the relationships with land, people, and state. And much of this requires study. It requires conversation, practice, and unlearning. And I found this really helpful to think about how can we get together, especially of those who are attending this conference, and engage in conversation, practice, and even listening and unlearning. So I hope decolonization, as I'm concluding my presentation here, decoloniality in whatever form, however scattered, however incompatible these different positions are, it becomes a formidable resistance and critical project of our times. I hope we can dream across transnational spaces, connect the here and there, have rich conversations about difficult subjects, engage in practice of cultural humility, and as I said before, unlearning. So let me leave with the last example. For the last 10 years, I've been working with a community-based organization in my city where I grew up in Pune. And this community-based organization provides sanitation to more than 1 million people who are basically urban and poor. The larger picture is there are about 600 million Indians who lack sanitation. And every day, every day, millions of women and girls in India experience teasing, sexual harassment, stalking, violent assault, and so on. And the numbers are pretty staggering. There are about 1,600 Indian children who die. So to me, we need to figure out how to mobilize with people who are working on the ground, the decolonialism in the academy and decolonialism outside. What does that really mean? Eva Morales has argued that all around the world, people sort of live in an urban sanitation imaginary, which she calls citizen shit, which means that you have a type of citizenship in which your shit is not your own problem. It specifically means that an urban citizen does not engage physically or mentally with their shit. Sanitation requires flushing. It's a state right. And engaging with shit means you live a backward life. So to me, in some ways, sanitation rights and decolonization and thinking about, to sort of say it crudely, human excreta, these are not dichotomous and mutually exclusive problems to think about. So let me end by saying that I feel a transnational cultural critical psychology is highly attuned to context of power, coloniality, psychology, marginality, cultural flows, human agency, and epistemic violence. It transcends this dualism that separates the individual and society here and there, cognition, culture, self and community, host or home society, and it's anchored in a social justice orientation. So my time is up, and I'll leave you here for the next presenter to come on. Thank you very much for listening to me. Cindy?
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I wasn't able to speak for a minute there, but I'm happy to be here. And thank you so much, Sunil, for opening up our conversation on these very critical issues around the importance and value of decolonizing psychology. It is my absolute honor and pleasure to be here today, to be joining you all at the Torre Decolonial Psychology Theories from the Global South conference. I'm joining you remotely from California very early in the morning, but very happy to be here. So my name is Jesica Fernandez, and I'm an assistant professor of ethnic studies at Santa Clara University. And I want to begin by saying a little bit about myself and my own positionalities, because I believe that is very critical and important towards this sort of decolonial project of disrupting and decentering the coloniality of power within the field. I begin by sharing that I was not born in the US, I was born in Mexico. But despite my predominantly US-based education, my transnational migrant border crossing experiences have greatly informed my worldview and my scholarly interest in decolonial methodologies and constructions of citizenship at the intersections of race, ethnicity, gender, age, positionality, and other forms of belonging, as well as the sociopolitical subjectivities of young people and immigrant communities who are resisting the permutations of oppression, power, and coloniality and all of its manifestations. And so today I want to briefly present some of my working ideas and thoughts on decolonizing participatory action research in community psychology. And I want to anchor this project within the efforts of various scholars, many of whom are attending this conference, especially within the work of Nelson Madurado Torres, who has called us into action into what he describes as the decolonial turn, which is a collective of theoretical and epistemological praxes that are not located within one specific discipline, but are rather multidisciplinary and transnational in their critique and disruption of coloniality and colonialism. And so in proposing an intentional decolonial participatory action research praxis in psychology, I strive to move us in a direction of transformation for liberation through the centering and reflecting of my own tales of tension in doing this work for over a decade in collaborative context with communities. So in what follows, I will be sharing some of these experiences, but first I want to begin by anchoring this work within a theoretical conceptual understanding of decoloniality and decolonization. And this work is very much informed by my own understanding and reading of Frantz Fanon, who stated very pointedly that decolonization never goes unnoticed, for it focuses on fundamentally altering being. And this is then captured in a virtually grandiose fashion by the spotlight of history that transcends over time, right? And it's this constant process of undoing. And so Fanon conveys in this quote the importance and the value of decolonization as an ongoing process and project. It is not an end goal, and as Eve Tak and Wei Yang write in their piece, decolonization, it is not a metaphor. It is not a replacement word or a practice or a description of social justice and liberation, right? Decolonization is really this process of undoing and of delinking these connections to Euro-American, Western-centric notions and systems. There are connections, of course, between decolonization and liberation. However, decolonization is an intentional act. It is a process of delinking these forms of colonial power and knowledge in theory and in praxis. And it is also informed by local epistemologies, by cosmologies rooted in the experiences and lives of local communities and the knowledge and the interdependence among ourselves and within our own existence. So decoloniality and decolonization are therefore a process of transformational change in knowledge, in being, in thinking, that are characterized by the forging of new possibilities, imaginations, and decolonial dreams of what could be and should be. As Christopher Sun and Maria Olga Reyes Cruz invite us or call us within our field, we must develop ways of being, knowing, and doing that contribute to decolonization and liberation. The centering of voices, experiences, and cosmologies that have been discredited and buried as a result of colonial epistemic violence need to be disrupted, and these voices and experiences and histories and ways of being and knowing need to be recentered. Although I am located within the US context, my work has been heavily informed by epistemologies from the Global South, specifically within the context of Latin America, and the work of Ignacio Martín Barró, Maritza Montero, among other Latin American critical theorists, such as Maria Lugones, Emma Pérez, Enrique Dussel, Walter Mignolo, and Catherine Walsh. Community psychology in the Global South is also heavily informed by critical, social, and political psychologies for and about liberation and transformational social change. In Latin America, in particular, community psychology emerged as a form of resistance, as a radical response to sociopolitical issues that were interconnected with these systems of oppression that were very much rooted in these histories of colonial violence and imperialism. Community psychology perspectives from the Global South also parallel, in my interpretation of this body of work, also parallel the work and the epistemologies and praxes and ethics and values of community participatory research. Like in Latin America, participatory action research is also rooted in social movements and local knowledge that emphasize liberation, multidisciplinarity, community engagement, sociopolitical action, and the affirmation of local histories, cultures, and knowledge specific to those communities. And the capacity to move between US-based and Latin American psychologies have allowed me to see where and how colonial thinking often surfaces and manifests within my own work. And it is my commitment to really be critical of how these manifestations of coloniality surface in the doing of research. Rooting my work in epistemologies of the Global South and of Latin American in particular have allowed me to embrace what critical feminist Chicanx theorist Chela Sandoval describes as a differential consciousness, as a process of engaging in these sort of methodologies of the oppressed. That is, in the methods and practices of doing research that are specific and unique to the cultural practices and knowledge production of communities themselves. So furthermore, Chela Sandoval also states that it is imperative that we not lose sight of the methods of the oppressed that were developed under previous modes of colonization, conquest, and enslavement and domination. For these are the guides necessary for establishing effective forms of resistance under contemporary global conditions, and therefore they are key to the imagination of decoloniality in the most utopic sense, right? So the assumption here is that while we might believe that we are introducing new methodologies and approaches and ways of being, for many of these communities, the ways that they embody resistance, the ways in which they co-create knowledge and challenge hegemonic knowledge and produce counter-hegemonic narratives, that in itself is already a methodology. And so as researchers engaging in these decolonial methods and processes, we must find ways in which we can support their ways of resisting and doing and constructing knowledge. And one of these paradigms that I believe is very useful in facilitating the sort of bridging of what communities are already doing is participatory action research. And I should just be very clear that participatory action research is not a method. It is a paradigm. It is a way of doing and understanding and engaging with and immersing yourself in an experience of co-producing knowledge collaboratively through a series of various phases, which I've depicted here in this slide, and for the sake of time, I won't go over them. But essentially, it involves an interrogation and disruption of power through a process of collaborative decision-making at every step of the research process. So within participatory action research, community members are not participants. They are co-creators of knowledge. They are co-researchers. The knowledge generated by communities can be used as political leverage to reclaim, own, and wield their power and advance their own agendas for change. I therefore approach participatory action research as a co-researcher with communities. I, in fact, learn more from communities when I'm doing this kind of work, and as an accomplice and an ally in supporting and advancing the goals that it is that they want to achieve. And it's also coming from a place of cultural humility and really interrogating my own positionalities and privileged identities, which I might hold in different spaces where I'm doing this kind of work. So the dismantling of hierarchical power relationships between participants in the academy is critical. It is an important part of this sort of decolonial project. It would be unethical to negate the position of power that the location of the academy provides for researchers. It would be equally irresponsible to dismiss the inequitable sociopolitical and economic institutional structures that support colonial research over decolonizing research practices and ways of knowing and being. So power as a tool towards decoloniality can help cultivate what Anzaldúa describes as a spiritual activism. And she describes this as a practice and a visionary epistemology and ethic for social change grounded in a relational worldview that uses this holistic worldview to transform relations of power for collective liberation. And so for the past decade, I've been engaging in participatory action research as a paradigm and orientation to disrupt power and to center the voices and lived experiences of predominantly Latinx immigrant communities and youth here in California in the northern part, bearing witness to the manifestations and expressions of their power and resistance, and accompanying them in their process has not been an easy journey. But Anzaldúa reminds us that there is no pure other, there is not a pure subject, and there is not a pure object. We are all implicated in each other. And so part of that implicability is really deconstructing our own positionalities in doing the kind of work and really interrogating ourselves if it is and how it is that we are really engaging in the sort of decolonial process. One particular experience that I have found very useful in allowing me to interrogate and really question my own positionality and approach to doing decolonial research and really decolonizing psychology, community psychology in particular, is really attempting to the surfaces and manifestations of tension within this kind of work. And it is, I believe, in these moments of tension where we can consider these very critical and important questions that allow us to really question our process and allow us to undo the colonial research relations of power that materialize in disembodied research and epistemic violence. Part collaborations and community-driven actions can produce tensions or these sort of cultural collisions or crashes, or what Maria Elena Torre and Jennifer Ayala refer to as sort of choques, right? These sort of collisions. Tensions can also lead to moments of productive dialogue. These can be opportunities for reflect towards engaging in a process of delinking and shifting power dynamics. And the transformation that comes with the experience of working through tension can be grounded in a critical reflexive praxis of undoing and of confronting the coloniality of power that may materialize at different points along the way of doing this kind of work. And so in what follows, I will share two brief stories of tensions that I encountered and experienced in doing participatory action research within the context of a community-based participatory action research project with predominantly Mexican immigrant women, 11 women who were a part of a community-based university community collaboration and partnership in a local community in the Silicon Valley, which is considered as sort of the home of tech companies like Google and Facebook. And this collaboration began with me offering a college-level course for free to members of the community. The members that decided to join this course were 11 Mexican immigrant moms who were long-standing members of the community. And so what initially began as a course centered around community-based research unfolded into a 2-year participatory action research collaboration and the development of 3 interconnected action projects to address issues of concern within the local community. These 3 interconnected projects then materialized in the creation of the mural demonstrated here in this particular image that highlighted their hopes and their dreams and also the critical issues that they were trying to raise awareness about and to mobilize around within their own communities. The creation of this mural, however, was not without challenges. There was many moments of tensions that surfaced along the way as we grappled with dynamics of power, representation, inclusion, and decision-making, as well as broader structural issues stemming from experiences of displacement and gentrification. So the first issue concerns the fact that there were many different voices that wanted to have a say in what would be depicted and represented in the mural. So in developing and designing the mural, we sought out the support and expertise of a local artist and muralist with experience in community art. We held various meetings with the muralist, and in the process of deciding what to include in the mural, he made the executive decision to include a woman in the mock-up of the mural that was not necessarily any one of the moms that have been involved in this project. And so this really unsettled many of the moms because they felt that their voices and experiences had not been a part of that process. And so that required a lot of conversations around representation, decision-making, and inclusivity, and also really interrogating his own positionality as an expert in this area of muraling and art, and an avenue for the moms to really assert themselves and their voice in deciding what it is that they wanted to have depicted. And over various conversations and meetings and reflections and really interrogating the reason for why we're coming to this work and what we wanted to see unfold, there was some consensus and agreement that the mural would then represent, instead of a mom, it would represent a child at the center with a heart, which is depicted in one of the sketches here. The second tension surfaced around the time that our mural was becoming completed and finalized. We were planning a mural unveiling ceremony, and an iconic mural just on the east side of the community, just a few miles away, had just been erased and painted over as a result of transitions on gentrification and displacement in the community. So as we are creating a mural in this community, in another nearby community, another major mural that had been there for more than 30 years was getting erased, right? And so witnessing the ways in which displacement and gentrification is manifesting in multiple ways was really a source of tension for many of us who were wanting to claim a space within this community of transition that was going to be impacted by the building of new tech industries and corporations in the community. And so one of the ways in which we resolved this tension was to join forces and to build coalitions of solidarity with the East Side community that was also experiencing these forms of gentrification and displacement, and to use the mural that we had just created as a platform to have conversations around who gets to decide for the community and how is land and space being used and appropriated and for what purposes, and to really not just decolonize and disrupt these decision-making structures of power, but to also decolonize spaces by creating spaces that affirm the identity and culture of these communities. And so to conclude, in reflecting upon these tales of tension that produce collisions or disruptions toward this transformative process of change and liberation, it is important to consider the ways in which a decolonial participatory action research process could be grounded in a critical reflexive interrogation of these moments of tension, and how these moments of tension indicate for us an opportunity for undoing the coloniality of power in all of its manifestations. Decolonial justice manifested through the transformational liberation power of communities cannot stay confined within theory, methods, publications, scholarship, presentations, or other forms of academic scholarship. On the contrary, it must be creative, public, accessible, and expansive to include cosmologies that are not rooted in Euro-American logics. Tensions in the pursuit of undoing and engaging in decolonial power, as Linda Tuhai-Smith reminds us, is about centering our concerns and worldviews, and then coming to know and understand theory and research from our own decolonial perspectives and seeing that as an ongoing process. So thank you so much for your time. It is my honor to have shared this with you, and I look forward to your questions.
So thank you, Professor Fernandez. And our final presentation is by Professor Joseph Gahn from Harvard University. And while he is getting his presentation up, I'm just going to quickly announce what we're going to do for questions. We don't have very much time for questions, so what we're going to do is take one question from one set of questions curated by us from the internet audience, and one set of questions curated by Shanaz from the audience here. So if you have a question, please take a piece of paper from the bags that you have, if you have a piece of paper, and jot it down, and we'll collect it and try to collate them for the panelists. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Greetings. I'm sitting in my office in Cambridge, Massachusetts this morning, and I'm really delighted to be joining this presentation panel. Thanks, Professor Adams, for pulling us together, and I've already learned quite a bit listening to my colleagues. I want to share with you today some reflections on early career lessons that I had that I think speak to the theme of the conference. So I know we're short on time. Let me just dive right in. The first thing I want to note is that I am an American Indian psychologist who's deeply concerned with the intersection of culture, coloniality, and mental health within the United States and Canada. And in our societies, we have very clearly pronounced mental health disparities. That is to say that we have epidemic levels of distress in many of our reservation and urban indigenous communities here. There's really high prevalence of trauma, violence, and the sequelae of those, plus substance abuse and suicide. And yet the community mental health services that are available for indigenous people, supposedly to remedy these sorts of problems, are really deeply underfunded, which results in this quite large unmet need in the mental health services context for indigenous people here. So you might assume, therefore, that in terms of addressing these mental health disparities, given that we have pronounced mental health problems, given that we have underfunded mental health services, the solution would seem simply to be to expand mental health services, right? Let's get these funded, let's get them available, and that should make all the difference. But again, thinking back to early parts of my career and some of the lessons I learned there, I'm not so sure that that's all that we need to attend to. In one of my very first research projects after graduate school, I ventured to my own reservation community in north central Montana, the Fort Belknap Indian Reservation, to try to explore questions of American Indian culture and distress. And specifically, I undertook a discovery-oriented, open-ended form of inquiries, quasi-ethnographic, you might say, with an extended family group on the reservation to try to get some sense for how people at home construe issues of culture, drinking, and depression. That is to say, I was trying to hold at bay or bracket some of the professional training and socialization I had encountered, and instead to look for emergent explanatory models or idioms of distress, which are the kinds of things that medical anthropologists talk about when thinking about illness experience. From those interviews and inquiry there at home, I talked to an individual who decided in our work together to go by his Indian name, Traveling Thunder. Traveling Thunder was very interesting to me for a few reasons. He was a middle-aged, monolingual, English-speaking Assiniboine Gros-Ventre tribal member from the Fort Belknap Reservation. He was interesting to me because he was a grassroots activist and a self-identified traditionalist. He did not have extensive experience or firsthand knowledge of mental health services or mental health knowledge, and so his perspective was particularly illuminating for the project that I was undertaking. And what's interesting to me is that when it came to trying to explain why members of our community suffer from problem drinking and depression, his explanation involved this really fascinating, what I referred to as discourse of distress, to make sense of these problems. And in fact, he talked about 4 historical eras that gave rise to these kinds of problems in our community. The first era, one that I've labeled Paradise, was this era of pre-colonial existence, a historical era prior to the arrival of Europeans to our part of the world. And what Traveling Thunder said was, quote, "See, there was no alcohol on this continent 500 years ago. There was no drugs. There was no problems, no domestic problems, no social problems. Everything was good because everybody lived according to custom and teaching. There was no jails, no hospitals, there was no prisons, no insane asylums. There was none of that stuff because everybody lived according to a strict custom." In other words, during this era of pre-colonial harmony, Traveling Thunder observed a balance in indigenous life that was owed to strict observation of custom. Of course, it didn't stop there, though, because Traveling Thunder acknowledged this second era, the era of conquest, or that which followed in the wake of colonial contact. He described this as follows, quote, "But when the white man came, they forced the Indian people to get rid of their ways, their religious, spiritual beliefs. They forced them to trade their economy, which was based on the barter system, on living off of the land, the wildlife, fish, and herbal medicines. Then they turned around and forced their culture on them, their religion, their beliefs, their foreign ways onto them, by taking all the young people out of the homes and putting them away in boarding schools, and forcing the white man's teachings on them. It's genocide." And so in this era of conquest, Traveling Thunder identified the annihilation of custom as a key signature of what that conquest entailed. He then described a third era, an era of loss, or that really contends with the aftermath of those colonial impacts. He described this as follows, quote, "If you don't know your own true oral history, your true oral traditions and customs and where you come from, and what's supposed to be important to you, well, you're going to feel empty. You're going to feel like you don't belong, because we don't fit in with the white man's system. We never did and we never will." It basically boils down to pride. If people ain't proud of who they are, where they come from, and what they're doing, then they're going to be doing these things, alcohol, drugs. And once you're into alcohol and drugs, you're going to probably get into a depression. You're going to not feel worthy of being a human being, and you're going to want to kill yourself. And so in characterizing this third historical era as an account of problem drinking and depression, he described anomie, a loss of purpose, loss of name, no identity, not aware of who you belong or where you fit in, as the kind of experience that leads to pathologies of these sorts. And he very clearly identified in our interview the, quote, "white man system," unquote, as pathogenic in this respect, that it gives rise to these pathologies through anomie. Fortunately, Traveling Thunder didn't stop here. He did think that there was a fourth era that we'd entered since the Indian rights movement of the 1960s. This was an era of revitalization in which a remedy to this colonial legacy might in fact be on offer. He described this as follows, quote, "After we looked around and realized that we left something behind, we started going back to the hills to fast. We started going to the sweat lodges to pray and to sweat. We started going to the elders to learn. We never was happy living like a white man. I would give the credit to the Creator and to the spirit world for pitying the people to allow us to get our sacred traditions back. To me, what that ceremony does is you're calling on the Creator, the spirit world, for life or for good health or for a good, clean mind, an alcohol and drug-free mind, or you're calling on the spirit world for guidance, or for survival even survival." And so for Traveling Thunder, we're now in this more hopeful era, an era of revitalization in which we were returning back to the same sacred customs that had kept things in harmony and balance prior to colonization, and that therefore yielded hope for a new way today. So in this interview with Traveling Thunder, I was able to really make sense of this explanatory model that he set forth quite clearly. He identified this straightforward pathological process, that is that cultural repression and colonial subjugation lead to anomie, loss of identity and purpose, and so on, which could give rise to substance abuse, and then depression, and then worthlessness, and then suicide. And so I showed you right in his words how he cast these links in causal form in this way. Interestingly, his explanatory model involved very little elaboration of personal distress. First of all, he didn't really talk about individuals. He talked about the collectivity of the community having experienced such things. But his account was relatively non-biological and even non-psychological. He didn't talk about brain chemistry or genetic loadings or psychodynamics or childhood experiences. Instead, he emphasized history, culture, and spirituality, and of course, colonization in this account. And in doing so, he really pointed very centrally to the pathogenic aspects of the white man system. He saw colonization as the cause of native distress. In his explanatory model really emphasized systemic factors over intrapersonal factors, and highlighted shared community vulnerabilities in this respect. And I think you can compare this discourse with what we talk about today as historical trauma. Historical trauma is all over Indian country today. People have really taken this up as a way of talking about and framing social problems, including mental health problems. But Traveling Thunder was distinctive in one sense. He did not reference the term trauma at all, and indeed his model was fairly non-psychological, whereas trauma itself is a psychological concept. Well, I wonder, and you might wonder, so what does Traveling Thunder think the relevance of psychosocial mental health interventions and services might be? And so I asked him, I put it to him, what are the conditions under which you would take a loved one who was in a lot of distress down to the behavioral health clinic here on the reservation and get them some help for some counselors or therapists? Well, he got quiet and thought for a minute or so before responding in a very deliberate, sober manner. And here's what he had to say about mental health services in the clinic there. Quote, "I guess it's like a war, but they're not using bullets anymore. They want to wipe us out, and therefore the Indian problem will be gone forever. But they're using a more shrewder way than the old style of bullets. If you look at the big picture, you look at your past, your history, where you come from, and you look at your future where the white man's leading you, I guess you could make a choice. Where do I want to end up? And I guess a lot of people want to end up looking good to the white man. Then it'd be a good thing to do. Go to the white psychiatrist in Indian Health Service and say, go ahead and rid me of my history, my past, and brainwash me forever so I could be like a white man. I guess that'd be a choice each individual will have to make." Traveling Thunder was clear that was not the choice he was interested in making, but in this statement he makes quite clear that he viewed mental health treatment not as a cross-cultural encounter, one that involved the potential for conversion of sorts. That is, that mental health services themselves can reflect or represent implicit forms of cultural proselytization into what we might call Western influence or maybe modern. So, in terms of this dilemma around inadequate amounts of services for meeting the needs of Indian people, the expansion of mental health services could seem casually important, but it's not so simple. We have this problem of cultural difference, that our communities represent historically distinctive cultural enclaves in which that distinctiveness continues to persist through some cultural practices at least, that are associated with different kinds of cosmologies or cultural psychologies, that the culture of the mental health clinic is not the culture of the indigenous community. But it's not just cultural difference. One could work that out perhaps by mutual understanding, but we also have the problem of cultural dominance, that we are talking about communities that have been subject to colonial subjugation. The boarding schools that Traveling Thunder mentioned were overt campaigns of cultural assimilation in which the slogan was literally "kill the Indian, save the man." And so we have these enduring power asymmetries that endure today, that continue today in ways that make this a very fraught enterprise or endeavor. So this has led to what I call a post-colonial predicament. The post is in parentheses because it's not entirely clear how post we are. In fact, we're not post in certain ways, although we may be in some other ways. The point simply is that on the one hand, we have quite urgent community needs. That is, many Indian people live in impoverished, high-risk settings in the United States, and we have these documented disparities in mental health status, particularly around trauma, violence, suicide, and problem addiction or drinking. On the other hand, the services that are on offer to try to remedy these problems are often said to be incongruent. Traveling Thunder characterized these as really an invitation to brainwash me forever so I can be like a white man. And the incongruence of these clinical services is attested to not just by community anecdote, although I do hear that wherever I go in Indian communities, but also by the research evidence when it's been systematically investigated. So if you ask community members who they would turn to in times of crisis, they don't really mention medical professionals or especially specialty mental health professionals until quite a ways down the list of people they would rather turn to. So this is a reflection back on some early career lessons that have informed a lot of work I've done over the past 25 years. And that work has yielded really an awareness of a completely alternative or alternative indigenous discourse about mental health. That is to say that when it comes to circumscribing the domain of the problem, this alternative discourse does not identify mental disorders in the way that psychiatry and psychology talks about these problems, but rather historical trauma. And the aspiration is not to try to prepare individuals to occupy forms of selfhood that could be characterized as neoliberal individualism. Professor Adams was talking about that being, free agents navigating free markets in pursuit of wealth and happiness, but rather trying to restore people to indigenous forms of self and personhood, whatever that means in a local community of interest. Third, the domain of intervention is different. It's not interested in the latest, greatest technologies that are supplied by researchers around empirically supported treatments that have been scientifically vetted in mental health circles, but rather to reclaim healing practices and traditions in our own communities. And finally, the domain of evaluation is even contested, such that the role of science and the importance of scientific studies is not as central, and indeed there's this rising interest around indigenous ways of knowing and trying to determine to what degree those might help us to better understand what will help to remedy the suffering of Indian country. Well, I hope this has been a bit informative. There's a lot to be said about these things. As I said, these are reflections on my early career, but my publications that speak to these things are available for download here. And I think I should stop because I think that time is short today. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, what we're going to do, we are short on time, but we're going to take the presenter about 1 minute and no more than 1 minute to address the following questions that we've called from chat. So questions are, is a decolonization of psychology possible within the current publication and dissemination culture? And what may be one critical decolonial act that you recommend clinical psychologists invoke in their work as an initial step? And finally, what can we do when we present to our colleagues to help them to understand the pervasiveness of coloniality in our field? I think that you all have access to your microphones, so you could just respond when you want to respond.
Can you repeat the first question?
Yes, the first question was, is decolonization of psychology possible with the current publication and dissemination culture?
I'll be really brief in my remarks. I think it's not sufficient. I don't find it adequate. I think it can be very limited and very exclusionary in my very early career experience. And I think, as for those of us that are trying to be very intentional about decolonizing the field and our practice and our theory and our research and all of that, I think we really need to be able to make this work more accessible and in various forms, whether that is through art or through other forms of expression, not just only through writing. I with some of the community members that I've worked with, many of them, because they speak other languages, indigenous languages specific to Mexico, their Spanish or their English is very limited, and so I think it's really important for us that if we're trying to do this decolonial work, that we also make it really accessible.
Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, please don't feel free to address all of them. Just one 1 minute comment on the question.
I'll just jump right in and pick up from where Jessica left and say that I think we have to speak about the modes of knowledge production within decolonization. And right now, the modes of knowledge production are very much asymmetrical. They're highly located within North America. They are the sort of gatekeepers of what counts as valid knowledge, what counts as legitimate knowledge. So unless we have a broader discussion, a very decentralized, democratic way in which we think about what we really mean by knowledge claims, validity, interpretation, analysis, persuasion, poetry, history, mythology, cosmology, alternatives, as Professor Gon mentioned, we would continue to reinforce the status quo. So we need disruption at a very fundamental level in terms of how we present our findings or what we take to be the instruments through which this knowledge gets. That's where I think the instrument shapes the knowledge. So it's like form and content. And that needs to change. So including, I think Jessica's point about community would be very valid to me. Who participates, who we overlook, and so on. So that's kind of my short answer.
And I would simply add that publication is just such a limited way to try to share and disseminate information. And so while it can be really important for those who are participating in forms of higher education, where they have the background and the preparation and the privilege to frankly understand some of what we have to write and access what we write, that can be useful in terms of circulating ideas, but it has to be activated beyond that in really important ways. And I will also add that I think I need to doff my hat to Tuck and Yang, whom Jessica referred to in their 2012 article, that decolonization is not a metaphor, because in the United States and Canada, the circumstances in which they write, what they mean by decolonization is not a metaphor is they don't use it in the way that we've been using it today in our entire panel presentation. They say that decolonization should be reserved as an issue of lands and territorial control in the United States and Canada of and by indigenous people. And so sort of in that sense, decolonization is about bifurcating the entire society into settlers and indigenous people, and that settlers have to surrender control to indigenous people, and then we can start to talk about the rest of this stuff. So they really would, I think, see this entire panel in terms of how we're using these terms as metaphorical. Doesn't mean we shouldn't use them, because there are other reasons. Professor Bhatia talked about, the internalized colonization with Mandy and so on. So I think those are important things. But we also want to recognize that decolonization in the United States and Canada can also mean, and some would say should mean, only attention to land and return of territorial control, material control of lands to indigenous people.
Thank you very much for your presentations and participation. I think the audience can also thank you from here. And thank you. And we'll be in touch, and anyone who has questions for them can certainly contact them.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.